Growing up, I always felt like I was a disappointment to my parents. They had spent years hoping for a daughter, and when I came along, a boy, they didn't hide their disappointment. I remember overhearing them call me a spare, as if I were some leftover piece they didn't need. Once I even heard them use the word remnant, which didn't make much sense to me as a kid, but as I got older, it hit hard. It was painfully obvious. I wasn't the child they wanted. I was the placeholder while they waited for something better. Their desire for a daughter was relentless. They didn't just keep trying for another child. They made it their entire identity. Family gatherings turned into discussions about how they needed a girl, and friends who suggested they should be grateful for at least having one child were brushed off. My parents openly claimed that unless it was a girl, they might as well have no kids. It stung more than I cared to admit. By the time I was 15, they finally had their miracle. My sister, Emily, she was everything they had ever dreamed of. From the moment she was born, all their attention, money, and love poured into her. It was as if I stopped existing entirely. I had always felt overlooked, but now I was invisible. They made it abundantly clear that she was their priority. They ignored my hobbies and interests, which were deemed distractions from their real focus. Emily. When Emily learned to say her first word, it was a celebration. But when I brought home a report card with straight A's, it was met with silence. It became clear that I had no place in their vision of a happy family, and what could I do? By the time I turned 18, they made it clear they didn't want me around anymore. On my 18th birthday, they sat me down, not to celebrate, but to deliver the news. They needed more room for Emily, they said, and it was time for me to move out. I was told I was taking away resources that should have been hers. I tried to plead with them, explaining that I just needed a few months to save up for a place of my own, but they wouldn't listen. They claimed I'd had enough time to prepare and should manage on my own just fine. So, just like that, I was out. I left with a few bags of clothes and whatever little money I had saved from odd jobs during high school. I couch surfed with friends at first and eventually moved into a rundown apartment. Those first few years were brutal. I worked night shifts at convenience stores and took on grueling construction jobs just to scrape by. There were nights I went to bed hungry, unsure of how I'd afford my next meal. Despite everything, I tried to stay in touch with my parents. Looking back, I can't fully explain why. Maybe it was because they were still my parents, and some part of me hoped they cared about me. I would call them occasionally, hoping for even the smallest sign that they missed me, but the conversations were always short and awkward. It was clear that they were just waiting for the calls to end. After 2 years of this, I stopped reaching out. It hurt too much to keep putting myself out there only to be met with indifference. They never called to check on me, never sent a message for holidays or my birthday. It was like I didn't exist. I came to terms with the fact that they had their perfect family now, and I wasn't a part of it anymore. Over the next 9 years, I built a life for myself. It wasn't easy, but I managed to find stability. I got a steady job, a small but cozy apartment, and made friends who became like family to me. I accepted that my parents were out of my life, and then, out of nowhere, I got a call from them. Hearing their voices after all those years threw me off guard. They sounded erratic, desperate even. They told me they needed to talk about Emily. Apparently, she had been spiraling out of control. At just 12 years old, she was skipping school, getting into fights, and hanging out with questionable people. They even mentioned issues with substances and legal trouble. My parents had tried everything, they claimed. Counseling, programs, even rehab, but nothing seemed to work. They had spent enormous amounts of money trying to fix the situation and were now financially drained. That's when they dropped the real bombshell. They wanted my help, both emotionally and financially. They expected me to step in, forgive years of neglect, and somehow fix everything. They even tried to guilt me, saying I was still their son and that family needed to stick together during hard times. But all I could think was, where was that mindset when I was 18 and begging to stay? I told them no, that I wasn't interested in helping. I explained that I had built a life without their support and wasn't about to put myself in a difficult position because of their mistakes. They didn't take it well, calling me selfish and accusing me of holding a grudge. The call left me conflicted. On one hand, I knew I was right to stand my ground. On the other, a part of me couldn't shake the guilt. That's where I'm at now, trying to figure out if I was too harsh, wondering if I'll regret this decision later. Am I the asshole for refusing to help my parents after everything they put me through? After that first call, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. The things they said, the way they tried to guilt me. It was all so much, it felt like they hadn't changed at all. They didn't apologize for the way they treated me or even acknowledge the years of neglect. Instead, they just expected me to sweep it under the rug and come running, but as much as I tried to push it out of my mind, I couldn't. A part of me wondered if I should at least meet them to hear them out properly. Maybe it would give me some closure. Maybe I needed to say my piece in person. So, after a lot of back and forth with myself, I texted them and suggested we meet in a neutral place. I didn't want them in my space, and I definitely wasn't about to go back to their apartment. We settled on a coffee shop in town. The morning of the meeting, I almost canceled. My stomach was in knots, and my mind was racing with what I wanted to say. But I forced myself to go, reminding myself that this wasn't about fixing anything for them. It was about me getting clarity. When I got there, the first thing I noticed was how different they looked. They seemed older, more tired, like the years hadn't been kind to them. It caught me off guard for a moment, but then I remembered why we were there. Before I even sat down, they jumped right into it. They started by begging me to help. They laid out everything in excruciating detail. Emily wasn't just skipping school or hanging out with the wrong crowd. It was way worse than they'd let on during the call. She'd been in and out of rehab multiple times, caught up in legal trouble, and was even sneaking out at night to hang with people who were clearly a bad influence. They talked about how much they'd spent trying to get her on the right track, even selling their house and most of their belongings to pay for everything. Now, they were living in a small apartment, barely scraping by. They were emotionally and financially drained, and they needed me to step in. "We're family," they kept saying over and over. Like that was supposed to erase everything that had happened. Like that word alone could magically make me forget how they'd treated me. I sat there, listening to them pour their hearts out. And all I could think was how little they seemed to understand. They weren't apologizing, not really. They weren't acknowledging the years of pain they caused me or how they pushed me away. Instead, they were just focused on what I could do for them now. When they finally finished, I took a deep breath and told them no. I explained that I'd built my life on my own, without their help, and that I wasn't in a position to take on their problems. I said I didn't feel any obligation to clean up the mess they'd created by spoiling Emily. I tried to keep my tone calm and firm, but inside I was boiling. Their reaction was immediate and exactly what I expected. They called me selfish, ungrateful, heartless, and every other guilt-tripping word they could think of. They said I was abandoning my family in their time of need. They accused me of holding on to a grudge and refusing to forgive. It was like nothing had changed. They still couldn't see me as anything more than a tool to solve their problems. They didn't understand, or maybe didn't care, how much their actions had hurt me. I stood my ground, though, and told them I wasn't going to help. Then, I got up and left. Walking out of that coffee shop, I felt a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was relieved to have finally said no, to set a boundary for myself. But on the other hand, I felt this deep, nagging guilt. It wasn't because I thought I owed them anything, it was more about Emily. I didn't know her at all, but the way they described her made me feel sorry for her. It wasn't her fault she turned out this way, not entirely anyway. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I wondered if I should have tried to reach out to her directly to see if there was anything I could do to help her without getting involved with my parents. But every time I thought about it, I stopped myself. What could I possibly say to her? She didn't know me, and for all I knew, my parents had been feeding her lies about me for years. And then, just when I thought I could move on, I got another call, this time from Emily herself. It was the first time I'd ever heard her voice. She sounded nervous, but polite, almost sweet. She said she wanted to talk about our parents and their situation. I could tell right away that she'd been coached. She launched into this well-rehearsed speech about how much they were struggling and how I needed to step up and help. I listened patiently and then told her the same thing I'd told our parents. I couldn't help them. I tried to be respectful, explaining that my relationship with them was complicated and that I had to prioritize my own well-being. But as soon as the words left my mouth, her tone flipped. She went from polite to furious in seconds, accusing me of being selfish. She said I was abandoning her and had always been jealous of her. She even claimed that I thought I was better than them because I'd managed to build a life for myself while they were struggling. Her words stung. Not because I believed them, but because they sounded so much like our parents. It was clear they'd been filling her head with lies about me for years. She hung up before I could say anything else, leaving me sitting there, stunned. That's when it all started to click. My parents had painted me as the villain, the selfish older brother who walked away out of spite. No wonder Emily was so angry with me. She'd been fed this twisted narrative her entire life. I called my parents immediately, demanding answers. At first, they tried to deflect, but eventually they admitted it. They had told Emily that I'd left because I couldn't handle sharing their attention with her. They made me out to be the bad guy, all to cover up their own neglect. I hung up on them after that. I couldn't take it anymore. They had not only ruined our relationship, but had also poisoned any chance I might have had to connect with Emily. Now, I'm left wondering if there's even a way to fix this. I don't know if I should try reaching out to Emily again or if I should just cut my losses and move on. What I do know is that my parents are never going to change. They're still the same selfish people they've always been, and I can't let them drag me back into their chaos. After that call with my parents, I couldn't shake the anger. It wasn't just the lies they'd told Emily or the way they'd manipulated the situation. It was the realization that they'd been doing this for years, twisting the story to make me the bad guy. All those years I spent feeling invisible, wondering what I did wrong, and now I understood that it was never about me. It was about their inability to take responsibility for their choices. Still, a part of me felt this nagging guilt. Not for them, but for Emily. She didn't ask to be caught in the middle of all this, and even though I barely knew her, I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. I kept replaying her words in my head, especially the part where she accused me of being jealous. It was ridiculous, but it also told me just how much she didn't know. I thought about reaching out to her. Maybe if I explained my side, she'd see the truth. But every time I picked up my phone to draft a message, I froze. What would I even say? Hey, I'm the brother you barely know because our parents lied to you your whole life. Want to grab coffee? It felt impossible, and I didn't know if I even had the energy for it. For a while, I tried to focus on my own life. Work was going well, and I had good friends who kept me grounded. But then, about a week later, my parents called again. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. They sounded even more desperate this time. They told me that things had gotten worse. Emily had officially moved out. Apparently, she'd gone to live with a friend's family, one that didn't exactly have the best influence on her. She was only 13, but somehow she'd managed to leave and cut contact with my parents entirely. They said she was staying with people who enabled her behavior, and they had no control over her anymore. When I asked why they hadn't gotten the authorities involved, they brushed it off, saying it was for the best that she wasn't living with them. That shocked me. They'd spent her whole life treating her like their golden child, and now, because things were hard, they were ready to let her go. It felt like they were giving up on her, just like they'd given up on me. Then, they turned the conversation back on me. They blamed me for everything. If I'd just helped them when they first asked, they said, none of this would have happened. They claimed that if I had supported them financially, they wouldn't have had to sell everything, and Emily wouldn't have spiraled further. It was absurd, but it still hurt to hear. I let them talk for a while, but then I cut them off. I told them straight up that their situation was a result of their own decisions. I reminded them of how they'd treated me, how they kicked me out at 18 and never looked back. I told them that their years of spoiling Emily had consequences, and now they were living with those consequences. They tried to argue, but for the first time, I didn't let them guilt me. I told them I wasn't responsible for fixing their mistakes and that they needed to stop blaming me for their problems. They went quiet after that, and for a moment I thought they might actually take it in. But then they started backtracking. They apologized, saying they regretted how they treated me and wished they'd done things differently. They said they never meant to hurt me and that they just didn't know any better at the time. It sounded sincere, but it was too little, too late. I told them I couldn't forget everything they'd done. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I explained that I couldn't sacrifice my life to fix theirs, no matter how much they apologized. They begged me to reconsider, but I stayed firm. I needed to protect my peace. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. I felt a strange mix of emotions. Relief that I stood my ground, sadness for everything that had happened, and guilt for not being able to do more. But mostly, I felt exhausted. For the next month, things were quiet. My parents stopped calling, and I started to feel like maybe I could finally move on. But then, out of nowhere, Emily reached out again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a message. It was short and to the point. "I'm sorry for how I acted. Can we talk?" I stared at it for a while, unsure of how to respond. I wasn't sure if I was ready to open that door, but something about her message felt different. It wasn't rehearsed or angry. It felt genuine. After a few hours of thinking it over, I decided to reply. I told her we could meet up if she wanted to talk, but only if she was ready to hear my side of the story. We agreed to meet at a park near her friend's house. When I saw her, I barely recognized her. She looked so much older than her age, like the weight of everything had worn her down. She seemed nervous, fidgeting with her phone and avoiding eye contact. When we sat down, I asked her why she wanted to meet. She took a deep breath and said, "I just want to know the truth." That caught me off guard, but I realized this was my chance to finally explain. So, I told her everything. I told her about how our parents treated me growing up, how they made me feel like I didn't matter once she was born. I explained how they kicked me out at 18 and how I struggled to build a life on my own. I didn't sugarcoat anything, but I made it clear that none of it was her fault. She listened quietly, and when I finished, she looked at me with tears in her eyes. "They never told me any of that," she said. "They made it seem like you left because you didn't want me around." Hearing her say that broke my heart. We talked for a long time after that. She opened up about how she felt growing up under so much pressure to be perfect. She said she always felt like she had to live up to this impossible standard our parents set for her, and when she couldn't, things started to fall apart. By the end of our conversation, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: hope. It wasn't going to be easy, but maybe there was a chance to rebuild something with Emily. As for my parents, I knew I couldn't go back. But with Emily, maybe things could be different. Part 4 continues. After that conversation with Emily, something shifted in me. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying the weight of my family's dysfunction alone. She had been through her own version of hell, and though it was different from mine, it was just as painful. We agreed to stay in touch, nothing too intense at first, but enough to start building some kind of relationship. It wasn't easy. Our conversations were awkward at times, mostly because we were still strangers to each other. She didn't know much about my life, and I didn't know much about hers. But the more we talked, the more I realized how much she'd been let down by our parents, too. Emily opened up about how they'd put her on a pedestal her whole life. She said they always made it seem like she could do no wrong. But that came with a lot of pressure. She felt like she wasn't allowed to make mistakes or have her own identity. Everything she did was for them, to make them happy. And when she started to push back as a teenager, things spiraled. "They never really listened to me," she admitted one day during a phone call. "It was always about what they wanted, not what I needed." Hearing that felt so familiar. It reminded me of how I felt growing up, like my needs didn't matter unless they fit into their idea of a perfect family. As we talked more, I started to see a different side of her. She wasn't the spoiled golden child I had imagined. She was a kid who had been set up to fail. Our parents had created this image of her in their heads, and when she didn't live up to it, they didn't know how to handle it. Instead of supporting her, they doubled down, trying to control her even more. Emily admitted that she'd made a lot of mistakes. She got into bad habits, ran with the wrong crowd, and made choices that got her into trouble. But she also said she didn't feel like she had anyone to turn to. "They always told me I had to be perfect," she said. "But when I wasn't, they just gave up on me." Hearing her say that hit me hard. It was like history repeating itself. Our parents had done the same thing to me, though in a different way. They wanted me to be someone I wasn't, and when I couldn't be, they pushed me aside. It made me wonder how much of their behavior was about us and how much was about their own issues. Over the next few weeks, Emily and I met a few more times. We didn't talk about our parents much after that first big conversation. Instead, we focused on getting to know each other. She told me about school, her friends, and her dreams, which were still a little fuzzy but revolved around getting out of the mess she was in. "I don't want to end up like them," she said one day. "I want to figure out who I am without them controlling everything." It was the most honest thing I'd ever heard her say, and it gave me hope that maybe, just maybe, she could break the cycle. As for our parents, I kept my distance. They'd stopped calling for a while, probably realizing I wasn't going to cave. But then, out of nowhere, they reached out again. This time, it was another guilt trip. They said they were struggling more than ever, that they'd lost almost everything. They even said they were thinking about leaving town to start over somewhere new. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, but I couldn't. They'd made their choices, and now they were dealing with the consequences. I told them as much during that call. I kept my tone calm, but I didn't hold back. I reminded them of all the times they'd dismissed me, neglected me, and pushed me out of their lives. "You always said family sticks together," I told them. "But you didn't stick with me when I needed you, so why should I stick with you now?" They didn't have much to say after that. Just more excuses, more deflections. They tried to apologize again, but it felt hollow, like they weren't apologizing because they understood what they'd done wrong. They were apologizing because they wanted something from me. When I hung up, I didn't feel angry. I just felt done. Done with their manipulation, their guilt trips, their inability to take responsibility. For the first time, I felt like I had truly closed the door on that part of my life. The only thing I couldn't close the door on was Emily. She was still a kid, still trying to figure out her life, and I couldn't abandon her the way they had. I didn't know what role I could play in her life, but I knew I wanted to be there, even if it was just as a supportive voice on the other end of the phone. Over time, we started talking more regularly. She even asked me for advice a few times, which caught me off guard. I wasn't used to being the one people turned to, but it felt good to be able to help. Even if it was just small things, like how to handle a difficult teacher or how to manage her time better. Through all of this, I started to realize that building a relationship with her wasn't just about helping her. It was about healing myself, too. For so long, I'd carried this resentment toward my family, this feeling that I wasn't enough. But with Emily, I had a chance to be something different. I didn't have all the answers, and I wasn't perfect, but I could be there for her in a way our parents never were for me. And in doing so, I felt like I was finally breaking free from the cycle of hurt they had created. The more I got to know Emily, the more I saw just how much our parents had failed her too. They might have showered her with attention growing up, but it was all conditional. They only loved her when she fit into their perfect little mold, and when she couldn't, they discarded her the same way they had discarded me. She didn't say it outright, but I could tell she felt abandoned. I think a part of her was reaching out to me because she was searching for something: stability, understanding, maybe even forgiveness. We started talking more often, meeting up every couple of weeks. Each time she seemed to open up a little more. One day, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Do you ever think we could fix things with them?" she said, looking down at her hands. "Like, do you think they could change?" I didn't know how to answer at first. Part of me wanted to give her hope, to tell her that maybe one day they'd see the error of their ways, but another part of me, the part that had lived through their neglect and manipulation, knew better. "I don't know," I finally said. "I think people can change if they really want to, but it's not something you or I can make happen. They have to want it, and honestly, I don't think they do. They're too stuck in their ways, too wrapped up in their own problems to see how much damage they've caused." She nodded slowly, like she'd already known the answer but needed to hear it out loud. "I just keep hoping they'll wake up and realize what they've done," she said softly. "But maybe they never will." That broke my heart a little because I knew exactly how she felt. I'd spent years waiting for them to apologize, to acknowledge the pain they caused me. But they never did, And I realized then that Emily was standing at the same crossroads I'd been at so many years ago. She could spend her life chasing their approval, or she could let go and start building a life on her own terms. "I don't think you need their approval, Emily," I said. "You're strong enough to make your own path. You've already been through so much and you're still here. That's something to be proud of." She didn't say anything, but I could see the gears turning in her head. I hoped she would take it to heart. As for me, I was starting to feel a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't easy. There were still moments when the guilt would creep back in, when I'd wonder if I'd done enough or if I'd been too harsh. But those moments didn't last as long anymore. I was learning to let go. My parents tried reaching out a few more times over the next couple of months. Each time, it was the same story. They needed help. They wanted me to come back. They even tried to use Emily against me, claiming that I was abandoning her too. But by then, I'd learned how to see through their manipulation. I stopped taking their calls, blocked their numbers, and told Emily I wouldn't be engaging with them anymore. To my surprise, she didn't argue. "I get it," she said. "I'm not sure I want to talk to them anymore either." That was the moment I realized she was starting to find her own strength. She was learning to set boundaries just like I had. And while I knew it wouldn't be easy for her, I felt proud of the progress she was making. Over time, our relationship grew stronger. We weren't just two people connected by blood anymore. We were building something real, something based on mutual respect and understanding. She started focusing on school again, talking about her future with a kind of hope I hadn't seen in her before. One evening, she called me out of the blue. "I got a job," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. "It's just part-time at a coffee shop, but it feels good, like I'm finally doing something for myself." Hearing her say that made me smile. She was taking her first steps toward independence, and I couldn't have been prouder. As for our parents, I don't know what became of them. I stopped keeping tabs on their lives. It was hard at first, but I realized that I couldn't keep carrying the burden of their mistakes. They had made their choices, and now they had to live with them. The truth is, I don't hate them anymore. I don't feel much of anything for them at all. They're just people from my past, people who taught me some painful lessons about what family shouldn't be, and while I'll always carry the scars they left behind, I won't let those scars define me. Emily, and I still have a long way to go. There's a lot we're both working through, and I know there will be bumps along the way. But for the first time in my life, I feel like I have a real family. It's not perfect, but it's ours, and that's enough for me. So if you're reading this and wondering if it's worth holding on to people who've hurt you, my advice is this: let them go. You can't change them, and you can't make them see what they've done wrong. But you can choose to build a life that makes you happy, one that's free of their toxicity. And if you're lucky like I was, you might even find someone worth holding on to in the rubble of it all. For me, that was Emily. And together, we're figuring out what it means to be a family, on our own terms. Thanks for sticking with me through this journey. It's been a wild ride, but I'm finally starting to feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be. Story 2. Greetings to all female partnerships. We discuss the issues that individuals deal with on a daily basis. First, let's watch the video. I've been married to my wife for 7 years, and I'm 35 years old. I had a lengthy and intense connection with this girl named Sarah before she came around. Before she made the decision to relocate to England, Sarah and I had dated throughout college and were engaged for a whole year. She asked me to accompany her, so I proposed that we go great distance. I couldn't simply quit my work, my nation, and everything to go anywhere. I may be unable to earn a living. I assumed she was lying when she stated we were splitting up and that it was simply a difficult time. However, she then relocated and changed her phone number, among other things. Even though it was difficult, I ultimately moved on. My present wife, Bella, and I met in school. She was a teacher of science. After we clicked, we began dating. Our marriage has now lasted 7 years. The real world differs from the fictional world. We argue, quarrel, and can go days without speaking. We also have a daughter who is 3 years old. It is challenging to care for her as well while we are both employed. This occurred a few days ago. I was arguing with my wife at the time. That day, my daughter's babysitter resigned, and we were pointing fingers at one another. that she must have quit because of anything you said to her. We couldn't leave Ollie alone at home because we had vital work-related tasks to attend to. Dot. As a result, tension between us was rising. She began discarding whatever she believed I lacked as a spouse and father. She even went so far as to claim that she makes more money to raise our daughter and that I hardly provide for the family. I reached for my vehicle keys at this point, but she ordered me to sit down and listen to her. Dot. She informs me that she doesn't think we should continue our relationship since she believes it has ended. I was staying for her and Allie, so I was shocked to hear it because I had been experiencing similar feelings. I believed that she still desired this and that I needed to put in more effort to support this family. I was obviously mistaken. Okay, I told her. I requested a buddy of mine who works as a lawyer to obtain the divorce documents. I was drafted half a year ago. I gave her a pen when I got home. She appeared capable of crying. She began to lose her temper. How? She simply shouted it out of rage and in the heat of the moment. She claimed she was shocked that I would deliver divorce papers to her in less than an hour. Dot. She was driving me crazy now if I had been planning to get rid of her all along. She stated that she believes we should dissolve our marriage despite my efforts to keep it going. She wants to carry on now. I tried to let her know that I didn't think we could stay married, so I prepared divorce papers. I shared a photo of us on Instagram 6 months ago around the time of her 4th birthday. Sarah sent me a text. I first made an effort not to think about what we shared in common. Allie looks just like me, she said. The fact that I am married and have a family makes her very pleased. I talked for a while since it was like catching up with an old buddy. Dot. She told me how much she still missed me when we finally got to meet. She regrets ever leaving me here and is devastated to see me married to someone else. She was my first love, but I try to be a sensible man. Marrying her and starting a family with her had always been my goal. I so made the decision to discuss divorce with Bella. However, I was unable to. I couldn't subject my daughter to this. I apologized to Sarah over the phone, but I have to change for the better since I now have a family. We continued to communicate and occasionally meet, but she supported my choice. I still adore her. Though not as much as I love my kid, I love her more than I ever loved my wife. Bella. S remarks turned me off, even though I was making a concerted effort to continue being the better father, and I'm no longer able to do this. I apologized to her, but I no longer love her, and she was correct when she suggested that we stop doing it. Is it wrong of me to still love my ex? A month has passed since I filed for Bella's divorce. We have been residing in several residences. I first remained at the motel, but I didn't say no when Sarah invited me to stay with her. At work, Bella and I cross paths. She claims that I cheated on her and deceived her, thus she won't sign the divorce papers. During my time with Sarah, nothing physical occurred between us. I adored her, and I always loved her. However, I didn't go behind my wife's back since I respected her. I won't get away with it, she said. That's so simple. I pleaded with her to accept the damn situation and stop destroying more lives. Even after I told her I loved her and apologized, I couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. And if I continued to act like the devoted husband in our obviously miserable marriage, it would be unjust to even her. Hearing her parents quarrel and rage at one another every night is something she does not deserve. She might just allow me to be joyful. She wouldn't even let me see. My daughter phoned her school to request that I not be allowed to visit her. This was becoming excessive. I followed Sarah's advice to seek legal assistance. I started by getting a divorce. I was shocked when she consented to a divorce, since I had assumed she would continue to oppose it. She did not, however, consent to custody of my daughter. She accused me of being an unfaithful spouse who is presently abandoning her for a female. She can't allow Allie to be in that type of situation because he cheated on her. Sarah loves Allie, who is a good, gregarious child. Prior to everything, Sarah and I intended to have a daughter named Allie when we were engaged, following the death of Sarah's dearest friend. I gave my daughter the name Allie for this reason. Naturally, Bella had no idea why we kept with the name since she loved it too. The problem is that Sarah adores Allie and would never treat her badly. Sarah won't be Allie's mother substitute since she already has one, but she's also not a negative influence, as Bella implies. Bella and I both work full-time at the school. Sarah runs her modest craft business from home. Having all of these custody rights would make perfect sense for me. I just want to be with my kid, and Bella is not even close to talking it out. Guys, here's an update from the last time. My entire life has been going smoothly. 3 years have passed. We celebrated my daughter's 7th birthday with our whole family and circle of friends, Dot and Sarah, my wife. It really made more sense for me to get all of these custody rights. Bella harbored resentment for everything for months until she lost control and began seeing Allie. She first detested Sarah, but with time, she came to appreciate how wonderful she was to Allie and that she wasn't attempting to take her position in her daughter's life, Dot. She got to know Sarah well enough to establish a casual, practical relationship. After about a year of that, I proposed to Sarah. She answered yes right away, so this time we didn't spend any time. In less than a month, we were married. It was a brief marriage at my friend's workplace, nothing special. Bella complimented us both and was surprisingly pleased to hear that Dot. In order to give us a small honeymoon, she even offered to take Allie on a trip with her. She and Allie had a week-long trip together. We did not object because we could see that she needed some alone time. Since she can only spend an hour or two with her mother on the weekends, she just missed spending time with her Dot. Our time together was the most enjoyable. Upon our return, Bella informed us about a guy she claimed to greatly like and wanted to have all of his. They run into him. Together they took a vacation. The fact that she took Allie on a trip with a man she had only known for a short time infuriated me a little. Allie is 7. Despite the fact that I don't trust anybody with her, I was pleased for her. I was never good enough for her, and she never was for me. Although we had a terrific relationship while dating, she should never have married. But I don't regret anything. We have a lovely daughter together, and I wouldn't trade that for anything. She has been seeing that guy for more than 2 years, and she appears to be quite content. After that, she was with me, and I'm really glad we ever did. We both want the kid Sarah is expecting to be a boy. I am really appreciative of the people in my life and the way things worked out. I only wanted to tell my tale so that others would be aware of it. No matter how bad things become, they can always get better and turn into what you wanted. Your whole life. You still have feelings for Sarah, and I don't blame you, but I have experienced it. I've never been married. I've never moved on from my ex, and I'll never be able to love another woman. NTA for continuing to love her, and I'm so glad that everything worked out well for you in the end. Bella received the better treatment she deserved. I'm really glad for it. For that, you are the a-hole. If you are not prepared to let go of the prior partner, you should never commit to someone else. You shouldn't have married and had a child with someone else if you were truly in love with her. It's simply so reckless. You handed a bag full of horrors to the next woman. Although it's fantastic that things turned out well for you in the end, that's not always the case. When you mentioned that you had feelings for the ex who left you to go abroad after 7 years of marriage and a lovely daughter with her, I can only picture how devastated your wife must have been. A hole for me. So about a month ago, I, a 25-year-old woman, gave birth to our kid. My 27-year-old spouse is still furious. I didn't anticipate how uncomfortable my contractions would be. Only after I was transferred to the real labor room did a different nurse eventually ease some of my discomfort, since the one who was assisting me refused to give me an epidural. My spouse was still on his way during all of this. After they've settled me up completely, he shows up and brings me some flowers after a half hour. However, I was happy that he gave me presents. Although I would have liked it if he had arrived sooner, the moment passed and I chose to ignore it. For the most of my time there, he was making jokes to attempt to cheer me up, and it was effective. I felt the desire to push when I had grown to 8 centimeters. However, the nurses advised me to deliberately prevent my body from pushing because I wasn't yet ready. This was the most agonizing, hair-tearing anguish I've ever felt. My husband continued, but I eventually told him to stop. I only needed vocal reinforcement since it was becoming bothersome. He did it loosely, but turned it into a big comedy, caressing my arm and saying that I'm as soft as a marshmallow, or grasping my hand and instantly turning it into a dog and making it bark. I repeatedly urged him to stop and that he was bothering and stressing me out, but he persisted, and I increased from 8 to 10 centimeters in that time. I told him to stop when the nurses brought the doctor, and if he kept making me anxious, I would request that he be taken out of the room until our kid came. The doctor arrived after he consented. Everything was prepared. My hubby makes the decision once pushing began. More than that, You've spread your legs. Given that my stress level was at an all-time high, you got this right. I went crazy. I began yelling for him to leave, and the staff assisted him in doing so because I was clearly upset. Sadly, my artwork didn't last long, but the delivery went well. I was taken to the recovery room while our son was being cleaned up, and my husband attacked me as soon as he entered. Since all he was trying to do was lift my spirits, he was telling me that I was overreacting and that I was a bitch for not allowing him witness his baby come into the world, that quote, what I told him. I warned him of the consequences and made it plain that he was causing me worry. He snaps. He begins to yell that the 9 months were not worth it, that it is unjust, and that he will never be able to relive that moment. He was wailing, so security took him out of the hospital completely. I was furious for the 3 days I was in the recovery room. Texts that just restate his remarks in new language. He has been neglecting me and our son ever since we arrived home. This entire month he has done nothing to help us. He hasn't even changed his diaper. I made an effort to get him to speak. Quiet. I don't know why he's staying at a friend's place, You are not the a-hole, in my opinion. He ignored your repeated requests for him. His actions were impolite and unsuitable. At the absolute least, yelling at you after giving birth is almost tantamount to verbal assault. Additionally, it is quite disturbing behavior that he ignored you and your son, as evidenced by the fact that he was taken by security for yelling cements. I would raise serious concerns. He doesn't seem to respect you, and it doesn't seem like that will change very soon. I hope you receive the assistance you require, NTA. I would advise you to stay with someone else or ask friends or relatives for assistance. It has nothing to do with controlling your rage. He will continue to feel justified for his actions even if he acts in the same manner for a month. Being angry for a short time and then regretting it is called having a temper. This is an issue of abuse and entitlement. I am a 25-year-old woman who resides with her husband and their 2 boys, ages 3 and 6 months. In the job and service industries, where it is extremely difficult to take time off, we have been having financial difficulties. In order for us to work, my parents cover the cost of my son's daycare. My sister Jess, 17, got into a prominent Ivy League this year. She won't have to pay the entire outrageous sum because she received financial help. However, housing-reduced tuition amounts to around $10,000 annually. Additionally, she was accepted to our state school, where she would get full tuition and no fees. After our parents agreed to pay, she chose the Ivy. My parents just sat me down and informed me that since they are now funding Jess's education, they would no longer be able to pay for my kid's daycare. Their justification is that their payments were comparable to those of my college. I'm really annoyed since I chose the least expensive college for me, and I believe Jess ought to have followed suit. Although we are all happy of her, it seems to me that she is prioritizing herself over her nephews. We are just unable to pay for child care, and I will probably have to resign from my position, which might result in our eviction. I explained everything to Jess over the phone and gently suggested that she take a gap year and get in touch with the state school to see if they would still accept her. Otherwise, She declined, and I became irate, accusing her of being immature and self-centered. Although our parents are upset and won't take my calls, my hubby concurs with me. She is not required to base her college choice on your financial difficulties. You've been fortunate. Up until now, your parents have paid for your daycare. They don't do this. You own it. She is not being immature or self-centered, but you smell very much like an entitled person. You work in the service sector and have no debt after graduating from college. You are unable to pay your rent, and you live with children in a 2-income family. That's on you, dude. Obtain a location to work that offers childcare if you are unable to obtain a good-paying white-collar job where you now reside. Your parents paid for your college education, thus they owe you nothing. The similar sum of money was spent on your education by your parents. It sounds like she put in a lot of effort to be admitted to that particular institution. If you had to spend the same amount as she pays for her Ivy League education, you would attend the least expensive university. Then she's receiving scholarships, whereas you most likely weren't. Your parents have no obligation to assist you in any way. What they do with their money is up to them. Your expectation that your sister will sacrifice some of her schooling for you comes out as conceited and self-centered. How come you can't afford rent if you attended college? What do you do for a living? Have you completed your education? I would advise you to make amends with your parents and sister and work things out. There are several ways the government may assist those in your circumstances, from daycare to insurance. Daycare is also costly. Therefore, your parents not only covered the cost of your education, but also your childcare. You've grown up. Act as though you do. Although this is a painful fact, you must take note of it.